that we record. So welcome everybody. This is the second in a series of at least 4 lectures that we're doing this summer. My topic today is pollinators, birds, gardening, how we can create habitat in our yards and neighborhoods with California native plants, and some principles about how we might plan for these organisms in our yard. Next month, August, what is the date, Deborah, for Dr. Griffin's talk?
It is August 19th.
So we will have another talk on August 19th. A personal friend of mine and a personal hero of mine, Dr. Dan Griffin, will be talking about the relationship between tree rings and our understanding of climate change. He's done some really fascinating work correlating tree rings with precipitation and actually generating 1,200-year precipitation records using tree rings of species like blue oaks. What does that mean for past climate? What does it mean for future climate potentials as we get used to more and more mega drought, and which has always been part of our system, and what happens when you combine mega drought with increased insolation, so more sunlight, increased evapotranspiration, because that's what we're experiencing now. I'll just say that, you know, the drought that we're experiencing isn't novel in terms of California's history. What's novel is the fact that we have fewer fog days, fewer cloudy days, hotter temperatures, more arid conditions, which is putting undue stress on plant communities. So Dr. Griffin's going to give us a little bit of insight about how the past might teach us to look ahead to the future. So look out for that in August. And without further ado, I think what I'll do is get into my slides so we can get this show on the road. So I'm going into presentation mode here. Stand by. Can everybody see that? I'm gonna assume yes.
Yes. We do.
Great. So we're talking about gardening for the bees, birds, butterflies, possibly even beetles, if you so desire, and just some principles and some great plants. So here's what we're going to be getting into. I've got some thoughts to get us into the mindset. Then we're going to talk about understanding our site, because I think, you know, more than anything, we have to be in context with our gardens. If we expect to have certain outcomes like bringing native wildlife, we have to know what kinds of wildlife we might be expecting in our zone. Talk a little bit about energy and how this plays into the story. If we're talking about ecosystems, we're necessarily investigating ecology, which in my mind is really the study of energy through natural systems. And then knowing our audience, so to speak. So these organisms that we're looking to attract, you know, it can happen accidentally, but if we want to be intentional about it, we have to know exactly who we're attracting, what aspects of their life history might we be supporting with our gardens, and then we can really think about how to do that. And then we have kind of a habitat creation primer. I'll talk about some design principles that I think are relevant to habitat gardens, and we'll talk about some plants. So let's get into it. As we begin, I would like you to just take a moment and think about where you are. And I presume that many of you are inside, but what I'd like you to do, if possible, is to imagine or look outside and think about the space immediately outside of where you are. And I want you to think about how you experience that space. So I have here an image. This is my yard, other scale, and this is how it looks to my eyes when I stand out here and I see this vegetable garden that I've been really excited about, alongside Eriogonum cinereum, ashy leaf buckwheat there on the right, that wall of flowers. But for a moment, I want you to think now about this space immediately outside of where you are. And I want you to imagine that you're experiencing it as a child. So what might it look like? How might it look different? So here from my kid's height, here's how my garden now looks, much closer to those melons, those squash. Everything just looks a little bit different, a little bit bigger. That wall of Eriogonum is a little bit higher. And now we're going to shift gears, and I want you to imagine that you're experiencing this space as if you were one of those wildlife you'd like to attract. So imagine for a moment you're a crow. And if you were a crow standing in this yard, how might it look? If you were walking around as a crow, maybe this is the scale that some of these birds that we're designing for are going to be experiencing. And then finally, what I'd like you to do is imagine that you are an insect and you're experiencing this habitat. So maybe you're down in here, you see the bee on the lower right of that image for scale. And hopefully this exercise puts you in a mindset now. When we design, we're not necessarily just designing for ourselves and our vantage point and where we see the world from. We actually want to get into this scale, this kind of miniature scale, smaller than a child, and all the way to the teeny tiny, because that's who we're trying to support, are these organisms whose eye level is very different from what we experience, whose concept of scale is very different from what we experience, whose concept of food and shelter and nest site and appropriate places to be is all very different. So what I'm inviting you to do during this talk is to really try to change your perspective a little bit and think about it from the perspective of the wildlife that we're trying to attract. And I think that will help us achieve the kinds of designs that really support these organisms that we want to invite into our yards. So that's the first thing, is knowing our site. Let's understand the context of where we are. And in addition to knowing your site, something kind of a refrain that hopefully not too many refrains, but one that I will be repeating is understanding what your goals are. What are you trying to do? Who are you trying to attract? Is it any bird you can get? Are there specific species that you're looking to attract? Are there certain birds that you see in your yard that you would like more of? What are your goals? Because that's really going to help you achieve this final design that hopefully is successful. So just a reminder, we live in this Mediterranean climate, so there's kind of a busy graph there on the right, but the green bars represent precipitation for Santa Barbara. You can see we are in our annual drought. Look down there at July. We're at the very low point of our rain year. So unlike most places in the world, summertime is a great time for precipitation and rain. In the 5 Mediterranean climate regions of the world, of which California is one, we do not expect really significant precipitation from about late May until really these days, October. You see the averages there. You can get a little bit of rain in September, October. I believe that's millimeters. Yeah, 11 millimeters. So it's, like a centimeter of rain in September and October. Not really measurable. These plants are drought tolerant, our California native plants, but for the most part, if we want them to be successful, supplemental irrigation for a year or two, just rule of thumb. And this is kind of an appeal. Sometimes we want to plant native plants that may be exotic to where we live. So it's tempting to want to put redwoods in our yards in Santa Barbara, or find, something that the garden has struggled with over years is giant sequoia. Can we just grow some giant sequoias in our garden? They don't like our local microclimate. Looking first to the plants that are immediately adjacent to where you're planting your garden and what grows in the wild out there and what's naturally surviving and thriving given the local microclimate. Those are all considerations that you should start to make and take cues from those plants that are around you that will help you understand what the effective plant palette is going to be. That said, I think going one step deeper, I mentioned microclimate. What's the vegetation community? What's the habitat that you're closest to. For many of us, it's kind of an urban, what they're calling a novel ecosystem, something that's really been created over the last half of a century or century, very different from what would quote unquote naturally be there. But we have patches of kind of native vegetation. So are you close to the coast? Is it kind of a coastal sage, or sometimes people call it soft chaparral community? Are you a little more inland, where you get more of the chaparral, the elfin forest, the really dense shrubby types of habitats? Are you somewhere in between where you get oak woodlands? So really spending some time to understand your site, and even deeper, know where you are. Look around your yard, and many of you have already done this, but I say it's a constant evolution. Understanding your soils, understanding your topography. Where does water flow? Where does water collect? What are your sun shade patterns, and how do they change over the course of the year? What is going on with your site? Because that's what's really going to help you make the right kinds of choices for the right plants to install that are actually going to survive, in addition to attracting the kinds of wildlife that you'd like to see. So doing this exercise might take a little bit of time. So spend some time going out and looking. If you're not chomping at the bit to make changes, I actually suggest you take 6 months to a year and just understand what's going on with your site. Understand what the course of the year looks like and those sun shade patterns as they're changing. Understand your soils. Know what happens when it rains and where the water flows. Know what happens in the dead of summer, those dog days when the sun's pounding down. Where are those plants going to need relief? And also think for yourself about, what are your goals, personal goals? How are you going to enjoy the space? Are there other projects that you're trying to do, such as gray water capture off of your laundry, which is, by the way, totally sanctioned by Santa Barbara County. They have a whole gray water handbook that can explain how to do your laundry to landscape system. So getting supplemental irrigation using water you're otherwise running through your system and watering your native plant habitat can be a really great combination. And taking time to understand what the potential is at your site is really going to help you make an effective design that not only attracts these wildlife that we're talking about, but it's also the space that you want to inhabit for hopefully years to come. And if you are having a hard time thinking about, well, how do I actually kind of record all of this information? There are tools. So iNaturalist there on the left is a great tool. You can collect observations from your site. If you're worried about people seeing your location of your observations, you can obscure locations. So they're just in a general area, but you can see exactly where they are for your own project. That's a great way to just inventory what you're seeing. eBird is a great tool, not only for recording data, but it's also great to just poke around and see, well, what birds are being seen in my neighborhood? When can I expect to see birds? They have histograms and bar charts of when birds are arriving and leaving in your local area. So that will really start to help you narrow down, what are the birds I can reasonably expect? Should you be expecting golden-cheeked warbler to come to your yard? Probably not in Southern California. Orange-crowned warbler, perhaps. Maybe you'd like to see Wilson's warbler. Well, what time of year do Wilson's warblers come through, and what are the things that they're eating when they come through? What kinds of plants would I need to install? Willows is the answer. And those are plants that you would want to install next to like a laundry to landscape or a gray water system, because they like their feet wet. They like a lot of water. Nature's Notebook there on the right is a tool for understanding phenology. So you can track the phenophases, so the life history changes of your plants over time. So when are they leafing out? When are they developing buds? When are they flowering? When are they going to seed? When are the fruits dehissing, opening up and releasing those seeds? Things like that. And that's a great tool for tracking changes over time of some of your plants. And there are also some data visualizations through Nature's Notebook In terms of data visualization, I'd say eBird is the strongest, and that's a great way to get a sense of, okay, well, what can I reasonably expect to see in my yard? If you don't want to take a whole year to make a bird list in your yard, take the shortcut and go to eBird and see in your area what you might expect over the course of a year. Similarly, you can go to iNaturalist and see all the observations that have been made in your area. You can see all the butterflies that have been seen and reported in a general vicinity. And so these are all tools to help you understand, well, what can I reasonably expect to attract? And then maybe you go through iNaturalist and you say, holy mackerel, somebody saw a mournful dusky wing, and that looks like a beautiful butterfly. Well, what does mournful dusky wing eat as a larva? What's its larval food host? What are the plants that support it? What are the flowers that mournful dusky wing likes to visit? And that can be a way to springboard you. You don't have to just return to these slides. You can learn for yourself that X or Y butterfly or bee prefers this or that plant, and I want to find and plant that plant because I know it will attract this kind of pollinator, or this type of bird really utilizes these berries as a food. So these are powerful tools for not only recording your information and sharing it with the world, but also for edifying yourself about your local area and what you can reasonably expect to attract. I think it bears mentioning that we just kind of remind ourselves about energy, and we talk, not we, but in the design world, in landscape architecture, there's this phrase, ecological design. We want to design ecologically. We want to be in harmony with nature. What does that actually mean? And I think for me, the big key is that virtually all energy comes from the sun, right? It starts out, the oil that we burn was once a plant that was photosynthesizing with energy from the sun. The food that we eat, whether it be plant or animal, has a direct connection to sunlight. The sun is super important in this equation, and even though it feels infinite, the sun is putting a finite amount of radiation down onto the surface of the earth. And what happens is plants can only capture so much of that information, or so much of that energy. And so you have, 100% of the solar energy is landing, and the plants are absorbing it, and they convert about 90% of it to heat loss and their own growth and energy loss and woody tissues and things like that. So that leaves about 10% for, the squirrels and the birds and the beetles to eat. But they're metabolizing and they're losing heat and they're absorbing energy into their carapace and into their pelage and all of these things. And so about 10% of that energy can move up to the next trophic level, where you have the snakes and amphibians and things like that. And so, we're talking about this kind of decelerating or a decreasing amount of energy that's available to the system. And what we can do in our yards is really think about these lower levels of the trophic pyramid. Think about, well, we can install plants, and those are going to support a certain number of herbivores, and that's going to support a certain number of predators or carnivores, and that can be the start of a little ecosystem in our yard. So as I tried to illustrate with that initial visualization of us getting into the perspective, this is kind of our sweet spot for gardening in our neighborhoods. We're thinking about these first order carnivores on down through the herbivores, and of course the autotrophs, the self-feeders, the plants. And a key to this is making sure that we're supporting our soil ecosystem, and that's a whole class unto itself that I'm not qualified to teach. But just a reminder that, whatever is happening above ground is a reflection of the health of what's below ground. So thinking about how we're building our soil, what does our soil fauna look like? How do we support more biological activity, more humus, more water retention and sponginess in our soil. And that's going to have major implications for supporting these types of ecosystems that are going to be really attractive for the wildlife that we want to see. So it is all connected, it's all integrated, and we sort of have to build all of it in order to be successful. So now I'd kind of like to talk about, as I mentioned before, setting goals. Who are you trying to attract? Are you trying to make a yard that's attractive to native bees? Are you trying to make a yard that's attractive to native butterflies? Are you trying to make a yard that's attractive to native birds? Are you trying to do all of that? We need to really think about who are these organisms that we want to bring into our neighborhoods, into our yards, into our communities, and what do they need to survive? So some of this is, I'm challenging you to do some research, to learn about the organisms that are around you. I'm going to give you some generalizations and rules of thumb, but the way that you're going to be most effective is to understand where you are, understand what the organisms are that you might want to attract, and understand what it will take to attract them. So here's some rules of thumb. In terms of habitat, right? We think about what makes habitat. Everything needs to eat. Everything needs to feel protected. Water is life. And in general, the greater diversity we bring to the table, the wider a web, the wider a net we're casting, particularly with our plants. More diversity is going to beget more diversity. And there are limits to that. And we'll talk about that kind of in design, and the principle of massing plants is really important for actually creating that habitat. But as a general rule of thumb, a monocrop of one plant is going to be less valuable than having at least a few species in the mix there. So if you can provide a water source to the organisms that you're trying to support, that's huge. If you know what kinds of food those organisms are eating and you provide those food sources, that's going to be a pretty good indicator that you can attract those organisms. What kind of shelter do the organisms I want to attract need? Does butterflies start as larvae? They don't fly initially. They need a substrate to cruise around on. They need something to eat. They need something to attach their chrysalis to. So that shelter, that structure is really important. And we'll talk a little bit more about how it impacts birds in a moment as well. Understanding the seasons, as I mentioned, California has a pretty unique climate. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have seasons. Understanding that rhythm of the year, and that's why I encourage you to take some time, if you haven't already, keep a special journal for your yard. Have a place where you keep notes. Using those tools like iNaturalist and eBird can give you a timestamp of what's happening and when, and understanding that relationship of seasonality and sort of what's happening biologically and life history in your yard, so you can know what to expect at different times of the year. This is by no means a static place, and ecosystems are not static, they're dynamic. And so if we are really trying to create ecosystems and trying to support habitat, we have to have the entire year's calendar in mind, and we have to have a bit of an understanding that our yard is going to change. Our space needs to change over time to support all of these organisms, whether they're coming and going, as with the migrants, as many of our birds are, or if just their life history requires us. Yes, I want native bees. That means we have to have blooms when the native bees are flying. If our flowering plants are all flowering in the winter, we're not going to have as many native bees coming to our yard. So seasonality is critical. And this idea of, getting a little nosy with your wild neighbors, understanding what they're doing and who they are, and recording some observations about those relationships is going to have a major payoff. And again, this goes for kind of your local open spaces too. Cruise around your open spaces. Oh, these birds just arrived. I wonder if I can attract them to my yard. What are they eating? That's a game that I've been enjoying playing when I walk around. I find I often don't know the answer, immediately, but looking a little more closely, what are the bush tits eating when you walk around your local open space? What are the flycatchers eating? Have a look at what the black phoebe is grabbing, and that's going to be a major indicator of whether or not you can attract them, is whether you're bringing the foods to the table. So let's go a little bit more fine scale, and let's think about some of these particular organisms that we might be trying to attract. So butterflies, you see with those two images, as I mentioned, butterflies have a complex life history. They start as these larvae, these caterpillars. Typically, they have a host plant or a host genus that they have to eat in order to survive. So we're not going to have, chrysalises of certain organisms unless we have certain foods for them. And the classic story, as you see in this photo, is the monarch with the milkweed. But monarchs aren't unique in the butterfly world. And planting plants that are larval host plants are going to be really helpful for supporting these populations of organisms. At the same time, I think we're all pretty familiar with what butterflies do in their adults after they've pupated, which, by the way, the process of pupation is mind-blowing. And you think about that caterpillar, that monarch caterpillar spins itself a chrysalis, and then it secretes enzymes and essentially dissolves its own body until just a few structures that we would recognize as butterfly or caterpillar parts are left. And then it, in that soupy primordial soup of being, it recombines into that's not a monarch butterfly, but structurally very similar, this California sister, and emerges as a butterfly. So just incredible, amazing life histories. And we can attract these stories. They can unfold in our own yards if we plan accordingly, which I think is really cool. And then as adults, they are honestly fairly clumsy pollinators. They kind of, cruise around, and they need flowers with big landing pads, big flat flowers for the most part, or maybe large heads of inflorescences, many flowers that create a landing pad. And they use their long modified mouth, which is a proboscis. It's if you think about our mouth is, our maxilla and our mandible, imagine that those got fused together into a straw and elongated. And that's what the butterfly is using to sip nectar. And, incidentally, if they get a little pollen on them, so be it. And they're not the most effective pollinators. They're beautiful and incredible and important for a variety of reasons. Ecologically, one of the most important things is used by caterpillars for other organisms to eat. Baby butterflies are bird food, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But I really encourage folks to think about the entire life cycle of these organisms, and that's going to help us effectively plan for them and see them at all their different life stages in our yards. Bees are equally interesting. The 1,600 native species of bee in California. I think California, someone will have to fact check me on this, but I think California has something like 10% of the global bee diversity, or something like that. It's incredible. We are a hot spot for many taxa, and bees are one of them. Most of our native bees are not colonial. They're solitary, although the bumblebees are colonial. Bees utilize bilaterally symmetrical flowers in particular. So you see that salvia flower, that sage flower to the left. They get in there, they get nectar and pollen. So the solitary bees will create these cavities either in the ground or in a horizontal cavity, and they'll lay their eggs, and then they'll put a little pollen packet that the larva will consume once the egg hatches. And that's sort of how they utilize the result of the flower. That's why the bees are cruising around there. They're getting a little nectar for energy for themselves, but they're collecting the pollen. And as a result, they end up getting pollen all over themselves. And so they become very effective pollinators because they're transporting all of this pollen that they're carrying in these packets either on their back or many times on their legs, and going from flower to flower and moving that pollen around, which is, of course, a prerequisite for the eggs of these plants to get fertilized and for seeds to form, so for the reproduction to occur. So just one more note on bees, since we have so many ground nesting native bees, one consideration for design is leave kind of an open, unmulched area at the edge of your yard somewhere that you might find some native bees, some digger bees, things like that coming in and excavating their little nest tubes, because you've created that shelter, you've created that habitat. So not all habitat has to be living plants. We can create habitat by knowing a lot of organisms want mulch and they want that cover. Some organisms need bare spots and open spots. So again, understanding the life history of these animals that we're trying to attract, and being willing to take some time to get to know them a little bit and know what they need and know what they want so we can support them, is going to be the most effective tool that we have for designing wildlife habitats. And birds, they have their own whole host of requirements, and they're obviously a really diverse group. But in general, caterpillars are extremely important. Something like 96% of songbirds feed their young a diet that consists 100% of bird insects. 96% of songbirds feed their young a diet 100% of insects. And the vast majority of those insects, in many cases, are caterpillars. So planting plants that attract caterpillars is going to help support birds. Think about where these birds are feeding, where they're hanging out, where do they like to be. If we have a ground cover garden, you shouldn't expect to attract a lot of birds that hang out in the mid-story or the canopy. So understanding how our design choices are going to support certain birds or not support other birds is really important. One of the things, if you look on the lower right there, maybe you've been hiking around and you've seen a flock of birds on the ground and you've gotten a little too close and they flush and they make that sort of shotgun scatter pattern. Next time you do that, I'd like to encourage you to think about, where are those birds going? And I want you to think about it sort of as an artist, where an artist will look at a scene and they'll start to think about value, and they'll start to think about, what are the darkest darks and what are the lightest lights that I'm seeing. I can almost guarantee you that the vast majority of those birds that scatter are going to be moving toward the darkest darks. So thinking about shadows, how is your habitat landscape creating those shadows, those interstitial spaces, those shelter, comforting sorts of nooks and crannies that the birds are going to want to hide to? So as much as we're trying to design for the attraction, the food, the water, we also need to know that when the Cooper's hawk flies by, or when the neighbor's cat walks by and the birds start alarming, they have to have somewhere to go. And that has a major implication for our design. Another thing to consider, again, if you look at the image on the lower right, something I love about that part of our desert section is you have a combination of canopy, mid-story, ground cover, you have edges, you have open spaces. So now there's this really complex and rich system and network of three-dimensional opportunities for the birds to explore. And if we go back to that introductory exercise, remember, the birds are experiencing this space at a very different scale. So when you get down there at the bird's eye level, for the birds that are feeding in the ground or the birds that are using the mid-story of the plant, you can really think about, how are they going to utilize this space? So these edges and escape routes. And one thing that I'm realizing I forgot to mention is think about nesting. Where do these birds like to nest? Are they ground nesting birds? Are they canopy nesting birds? What sorts of materials do they nest with? Hummingbirds utilize a lot of spider webs. Certain birds will weave, fine strands from palm fronds, for instance, or pine needles, or soft downy fluff from cottonwoods and salix, willows, and sycamores and things like that. So are we planting plants that are providing the sorts of materials that organisms can use at different times in their life history? So again, I want us to think about habitat gardening as not just being providing food. It's not just about the bird feeder and a bird bath and a shrub next to it. How are we supporting the entire life history of these organisms, which again goes back to setting goals, who are the organisms I want to attract, and knowing your audience, knowing your neighbors, what do they need to survive? And I just want to throw out there are so many amazing creatures that we can be attracting. So plenty of dragonflies, odonates, damselflies that with just a little water feature, we can be supporting them. They do live underwater as larvae for up to 2 years, which is pretty cool, but you may have a nearby water feature or a perennial creek or pond or something like that. And having good habitat adjacent to that water source can mean you're attracting some of this wildlife. Beetles are great pollinators and cool animals. There are plenty of really awesome flies out there, hundreds of species that we can be attracting. So don't just stop with the birds and bees and butterflies. Let's think about the whole network of organisms we can be supporting. So I'd like to just take a moment to talk a little bit about design. Since I do have a degree in landscape architecture, I feel like I have to use it to some degree. I think, what's kind of cool is if you think about some of the design elements, I learned that there are 5 of them. Some people say there are 7, some people are more, but I think 3 of them in particular can be really useful when planning habitats. So this idea of rhythmic habitat, where you're creating these hummocks, these areas of light and shadow that birds in particular are going to be attracted to as hiding places. This idea of unity and variety, diversity is important, but we also need to be massing some of these plants, particularly for pollinators. One flower isn't going to cut it. You got to have 100 flowers, 1,000 flowers, better yet, hundreds of inflorescences. So you see those buckwheat inflorescences in the middle left. So each one of those little creamy colored puffballs is actually dozens of flowers together. So these flowers that have inflorescences can, again, since we're at this really small scale of these pollinators of these insects, that makes a huge impact in terms of habitat. And then, as I've been saying, thinking about scale, what is the scale that we're working within when we're trying to create this habitat? What is the size of the organism? How much space do they need? How much do they need in terms of resources? And it also goes for us and our own aesthetics, what we like to see, what we want around us. That's kind of the thing with gardening, is we get to choose what we're growing and what we attract. And you can apply these principles to create an aesthetically pleasing, a comfortable, and an otherwise effective space that you want to be in, that you want to experience, that you want to explore. So that, again, what you want to get out of this is as important as the wildlife, I think, because, I imagine many of you are home gardeners. And how do you want your space to be? What do you want to enjoy? Again, are those projects out there that dovetail with some of the outcomes? So you want to attract the Wilson's warbler. You need willows to attract the Wilson's warbler. We live in an arid climate. If you install laundry to landscape or some sort of gray water system, you might be able to, using the topography of your yard, create a basin where the water will collect, where you can grow a patch of willows and not feel like you're using a bunch of supplemental irrigation, and know that they're going to have their feet wet. They're going to be growing effectively, and that's going to greatly increase your chances of attracting some of those birds that you want to see. So under your kind of intersects the lives of these organisms, it's kind of a beautiful thing, right? We talk about living harmoniously with nature. I don't know if this is necessarily a model for harmonious living, but at least it's one that takes other organisms into consideration and allows us to kind of think on an ecosystem level beyond just ourselves and our immediate family and what we as humans want to experience in our space. So now let's just transition to, I have about a dozen plants that I'd like to recommend you consider for attracting and achieving some of these outcomes related to habitat. Gotta love the sages. Who doesn't love a sage in California? There's so many species, primarily spring bloomers, generally pretty open growth forms, kind of fountain shaped. You're gonna get maybe 3.5 inches of height out of them, a spread of 3 to 4 feet. Some of them get drought deciduous. So if you're really interested in that drought tolerant landscape, these plants will survive. But like a Salvia mellifera or black sage, at the end of August or something like that, if you've cut it off from irrigation, might start to lose its leaves a little bit. That's normal. It's just dealing with the stress of low precipitation and high evapotranspiration. A lot of water gets lost through photosynthesis. That's one of the byproducts of photosynthesis. And some of these plants have adapted to just shed their leaves when the insolation is very high. There's a lot of sun, there's low humidity, you're desiccating very quickly. Just lose that leaf and rely on stored energy until the rains return and you can grow the leaves back. This is also a maintenance consideration when you are thinking about your inflorescences and they've done so much for your native bees and you've identified 5 or 6 species of native bees that you've supported. Don't just deadhead those inflorescences, leave them. The goldfinches are going to eat the seeds, the towhees are going to eat the seeds, the sparrows are going to eat the seeds, and you don't have to buy bird seed. You'll just have a natural bird feeder sitting in your yard, which is pretty cool. Another great plant, so a little bit bigger. This is our heteromeles, our beautifolia, our toyon. Thinking about seasonality, this is a plant that's blooming right now, so extending your season outside of spring into the summer blooms. And then in the wintertime, you've got these beautiful red berries that are not only seasonally attractive, but they're great for thrushes. They're great for waxwings. Other frugivorous birds are going to be attracted to your yard, hanging out, eating the profusion of fruits that you've provided. Another member of the rose family, Rosaceae, is our Catalina cherry, Prunus ilicifolia. This is a subspecies lioni. It's a medium-sized tree. It blooms a little earlier than the toyon. It's kind of a late May into June bloomer. Pollinators love it. It has kind of a sweet, musky smell, which I very much like. Evergreen leaves, which are always nice to have. And then the fruits are great. One thing just to know about this plant is when birds are eating fruit, it goes somewhere, right? It goes through their system, and you're going to have bird poop. So just be thoughtful about some of these plants. Like we were discussing in the beginning, with the juncos that have nested in the nursery at the garden, the king snake that was sniffing around trying to get the juncos. When we bring these organisms into our yard, they're going to do their thing. And we have to be okay with what that means. So that means there are going to be feces of animals in our yards. Spotted towhees are going to be doing their double shuffle and kicking the mulch into our paths and things like that. So what you're getting yourself into. And that's why I say kind of know your goals, do a little bit of research. If I attract this bird, what is it going to be actually functionally be doing in my yard? And is that something that I want to be happening in my yard? Love the buckwheats. I mean, this is a group, I think they're somewhere close to 200 species of buckwheat in California. Many of them are annuals and they aren't commercially available. But there are, I'd say, dozens of either straight species or cultivars out there, ranging from pretty small, compact. This in the lower left, the Eriogonum grande, the island subspecies rubescens, with those great exerted inflorescences, all the way to quite large, like that Eriogonum cinereum in the upper right, which can be like a 7x7, 8x8 even, feet wide. The Eriogonum fasciculatum, which is California buckwheat, flat top buckwheat, tough as nails, top performer. That'll get to be about a 5x5. But you can get some more compact, creeping, prostrate selections or cultivars like the Warner Little, which is a low-growing, compact Eriogonum fasciculatum. So lots of choices with the buckwheats, which is pretty cool. Love an elderberry. Another small to medium tree. It tolerates a lot of different soils and sun exposures. It can be full sun to part shade, and it'll do okay in full shade even. I've been doing a little research. There's a resource that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology curates called Birds of the World, and you can find out diet information. And tons of birds eat elderberries. It's also a larval host species to a number of moths. Flowers being those inflorescences with many flowers on the umbels attract a wide variety of pollinators. Love an elderberry, and they can be kind of trained. They can look a little sad if they're in a very dry, exposed area in the summertime. But give them a shot of water and they'll be all right. Or just know that they're going to look a little bit sad, and that's okay. I love frangula. Beautiful berries. Look at those fruits. Really cool flowers. They're inconspicuous. They're cryptic flowers down in that lower image. Great for pollinators, great for beneficial insects. Tolerates a wide variety of conditions. It can get pretty large if you're looking for a large evergreen shrub, but then there are also compact forms too, and cultivars that you can get that aren't going to get quite as large. Encelia, this is a shorter lived species. What we call those flowers are actually inflorescences, disc flowers in the center, all of those brown florets, ray florets on the outside. So those yellow, what we would call petals, she loves me not. Each one of those is actually a flower unto itself. For the most, I don't know about the most part, but oftentimes those ray florets are sterile, and all the reproduction happens in the center. This is a plant that will self-seed, so you can have it successionally. It's also fairly short-lived, so maybe if you're trying to establish a larger shrub or a tree, you put this underneath and it'll kind of run its course, and maybe that shrub will have grown in by the time the encelia and so good. And it's also one of those kind of drought deciduous plants. So just know what you're getting yourself into with some of these choices. Another member of Asteraceae, the sunflower family, Solidago, goldenrod, again, extending your season. This is the late season blooms. So you're going to attract pollinators in the summer and late summer into the fall, depending on your water regime, depending on the year, depending on your site and how saturated the soils are. And then you'll have seeds that are available to goldfinches and sparrows into the fall and winter. Our California lilacs, our ceanothus, again, horticulturally diverse. You can get all kinds of flower colors from white to purple to powder blue to royal blue, all kinds of different growth forms. Really beautiful and impressive. And just one of my favorite kind of human connections with this plant is you grab an inflorescence and you put your hands underwater with it and you scrub around all those flowers and it starts to suds. You get soap, and it's actually a surfactant that will clean your hands. So a little human use in there too, if you're willing to share with the pollinators, or if the pollinators are willing to share with you. I love a quail bush, a nice atriplex, salt bush. It's a cool genus. same family as beets and spinach and Quinopodiaceae. Cool plants. My plant materials professor in graduate school called this plant instant habitat. Just look at that plant. Look at all those shadows. Look at all those places for birds to hide. Quail in particular. The name is such, but the seeds are attractive. The flowers are attractive to pollinators. There are a number of butterflies who use this as a larval host plant. It's great. They can get big, 12 by 12. But it's really an awesome plant, and they can also tolerate just awful soils. And they have, I don't know the results, but I think they've been used in a little phytoremediation. So places that have heavy metals and other kind of contaminants, this plant will actually kind of absorb those and release them from the soil a little bit. And then the great granddaddy, if you have space for an oak, there's almost no better habitat plant in our region than an oak. So many species, studies have shown that 300, 500 species of caterpillars, that's just butterflies and moths, are supported by our California oaks. Not to mention the wasps, not to mention the beetles, not to mention the flies, not to mention the bees. Honeybees in particular seem to be attracted to the flowers. They're wind pollinated, but I think enough incidental pollen can be captured that oftentimes when they're flowering, you hear a buzz of you. There are some scrub oaks that you could consider if you don't have a lot of space. They are slow growing, but they'll give you a lot of the same habitat benefits in half the space or a third of the space. So Quercus barbidifolia, for instance, or Quercus dumosa, which is actually kind of a specialty of our area, Santa Barbara scrub oak. So there are lots of options out there within the genus of Quercus, but it can be a tricky one. They're slow growing, they're big, and they can be a little messy. So those are some of my top plants, and that's sort of my my tour of habitat creation, and we're running up against time here. So I think what I'll do is just say thank you so much for your attention. I hope there was a nugget in there that you were able to grab onto, and I can stop screen share and take some questions or comments. Feel free to fire away if there are any questions. Big long list of plants to ask about. All right, let's see what you got. And what are the questions about the plants?
Let's see. Think of a question.
I mean, one genus that I didn't include that I mentioned a couple times is Salix, the willows. If you're able to if you have a wet spot, if you have gray water capture, if you have some way, to capture rainwater, a retention basin, Salix exigua and Salix laevigata are two good species. I talked about a number of these. California buckeye is actually poisonous to honeybees. Western redbud is a good early season pollination plant. Manzanitas can be good habitat structure. They're slow growing. They can be a little bit tricky. The aphids that form galls on manzanita leaves aren't terribly attractive, but they could be good bird food. We talked about the saltbush. That was the Atriplex. Nevin's barberry is a great choice. The flowers are attractive to pollinators. It creates good structure. Ceanothus, I think in general, if we can choose our local species and the straight species are probably going to be better for wildlife. But if you really have a certain look that you want and you want to pull a cultivar, that'll be good. We talked about the buckwheats. We talked about the sages. Currant, I was very close to putting the genus Ribes, the gooseberries and currants on my list. They're good habitat structure. They have flowers that are really attractive. They have fruits that attract a wide variety of wildlife. The Western Columbine, it's pretty good. I'd put it in the medium category. Goldenrod, we talked about. Mallows, I love the mallows. I should have put that on the list, especially for bees. The native bees love members of Malvaceae, so the genus Sphaerosia is a good one. Malacothamnus are bush mallows, so they're going to get a little more height, a little more structure. If you're looking for any kind of screening or anything like that, planting a row of Malacothamnus is, again, gets that kind of human outcome of getting the living fence, the living wall, but it also provides pollinator habitat. California fuchsia is a great one, particularly for hummingbirds, those long red tubular flowers. And island pink yarrow, I'd say I put that kind of in the medium category from what I've seen. So there's a quick run through of that list.
Any thoughts on mountain mahogany?
I love mountain mahogany. It's another one of those great screen plants in the rose family. In particular, I think it's good for larval host plant. There are a couple of hair streaks that really like mountain mahogany. I think the fruits are really beautiful. I don't know in terms of habitat value if they bring that much, but I think they're quite lovely. They bloom around April and they can be attractive. They're in the rose family. Members of the rose family tend to be pretty good for pollinators in general. They have a lot of small flowers that attract a lot of things. I love mountain mahogany.
Yeah, we like it too.
Lemonade berry.
Oh, yeah, lemonade berry. What do you think of that? We have a lot of that.
Oh, it's great. I think for me, in my mind, lemonade berry is best for bird structure. It's going to be where the birds are hanging out, hiding out. It does so well in the Santa Barbara region, the Central Coast. It's going to grow big for you. Another thing is in terms of, again, thinking about your goals, your design, maintenance, it takes a hard pruning. So you can really cut it back. And we have that hedge on the courtyard of the garden. It takes that hard pruning. You can really shape it. So it's very malleable in that way. So it's kind of a good human/wildlife habitat plant. I don't think it is, from what I've seen, it's not going to be pulling the widest array of pollinators, but maybe I just haven't looked closely enough when it's in bloom. Human edible native plants. I mean, honestly, those grow some miner's lettuce, some claytonia. That's not really going to be as much of a habitat plant. Your oak is going to give you lots of acorns. Wild grape, that can be a good one if you're looking for food. It's a great vine. And a couple of years ago, there was a gray catbird, which is really an eastern bird, late season. So it was probably a first-year bird that was dispersing, trying to find its way back south, ended up in California at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, and it was munching down on dried up grapefruits. Thing about native California grape is they're small fruits with big seeds. So don't expect to, have gallons of grape jelly off of a California native grapevine. The Rogers Red is a hybrid between a table grape and California grape. The fruits are still pretty small, but it's good. We made dolmas in my house out of the leaves a couple weeks ago. That was pretty cool. Fresh from our yard, dolmades. That was fun. Some of the ribes, some of the gooseberries, those will give you some fruits. But again, that's something where you're going to need, dozens of plants if you really want to do something with them. Otherwise, you're just going to be competing with the birds and other frugivores that hopefully you're trying to attract.
Mhm.
Get a machine gun out there.
Bird feeders, I mean, personal opinion, I think if you're using the native plants to provide habitat, they're not necessary. And I start to ask questions, where does that bird seed come from? You buy it in that package. Where was it grown? What's even in there? How was it grown? Could that space have been used to grow food for folks? I mean, we can grow food for our plants and animals. We can grow food for ourselves. So personally, I tend to try to be, I guess maybe it's a purist, but maybe that's my challenge that I try to make for myself. How do I create this habitat without bringing anything in? But you want to put up a bird feeder? Go for it. Just think about those escape routes. Are you creating an artificial slip for a Cooper's hawk or a pygmy owl to just pick off birds from your bird feeder? Or are you providing those appropriate edges and escape routes? So when danger comes, or when the cat's cruising by, the neighborhood cat, the birds have somewhere to go and they're not just,
Sitting ducks.
food on the wing. Plants not higher than 3 feet that bloom in the winter. I'd say you should think about some of our creeping manzanitas. Some of our prostrate manzanitas are going to bloom in the winter. They'll stay pretty low for you. The Erigeron glauca, the seaside daisy, that'll bloom for you in the wintertime if you're treating it right. Solidago might, depending on the conditions of your microsite, bloom for you in the winter. Some of our early sages, they're late winter, early spring. They'll stay kind of small. Winter bloomers. Not higher than 3 feet. The evergreen currant, the Ribes vibernifolia, that one blooms kind of in the wintertime, and you can keep that pretty low. You can keep it in a creeping form. Hopefully that helps. Well, I hope there was a little something for you all in there, and people got a little bit out of this. Glad you spent some of your Friday evening with me. And hopefully this is just the beginning. I didn't want, the intention wasn't for you to get all of the information out of this lecture. It's to whet your appetite, hopefully give you some principles and skills that you can apply, and to start a conversation. So I welcome you to get in touch. I'll drop my email in the chat box. Yeah, stay in touch. Come by the garden. Check out the habitat that we've got going. Come look at what's blooming. Look at what the insects are attracted to. Talk to our staff. And it's about the process. It's about the journey rather than the end result. It's about sharing with each other. So hopefully this is just the beginning of a long conversation that we can all have together. Yeah.
Okay.
August 19th, right, Deborah? Dr. Dan Griffin.
It is.
He's the man. He's great. He's a fabulous scientist. He's a really great guy, and he just brings such an amazing perspective. One of my favorite things to do is talk to Dan about tree rings. So I hope you all take the time to check out his lecture. And this is being recorded. If you want to go back to this, we'll share a link once the recording is available. And yes, we do have lectures in September from our conservation team. So thank you all. Happy Friday. Shabbat Shalom. Enjoy your weekend. And I hope to see you around the garden.
Thank you very much. That was good.
Thank you, Scott.